Start. And I'd like to introduce tonight's presenter. Everybody ready? Jacob Klein has developed a commitment to working within the Jewish world to make spaces inclusive of marginalized identities and to progress toward a more just future. They began campaigning for queer issues while studying abroad in Ireland on equal rights for civil marriage and trans visibility. This lit a spark in them that has grown to the work they now do as the Bay Area Programs Manager for Keshet, running the community building programs and institutional change work in the Bay Area. They are a leader of Glitter Kahila, an East Bay group that centers queer leadership and builds radically inclusive Jewish community for young adults through ritual and social justice. They are an alum of Ben the Ark's Jeremiah Fellowship, former co-chair of Ben the Ark Bay Area's Criminal Justice Reform Campaign Team, and a graduate of UCLA with a degree in English Literature, Creative Writing. Originally from San Diego, they now live in Oakland, California. So, Jacob, take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. I'm a little nervous and I've never led a webinar before, so I might be like a little bit shaky, but please bear with me. I'm also a little bit tired because I'm in Boston right now, having traveled here last night for a staff retreat with my organization. So as Emma said, my name is Jacob Klein. My pronouns are they, them, and their. I'm the Bay Area Community Programs Manager for Keshet. And Keshet is a national organization that works for full LGBTQ inclusion. Main office is in Boston, which is why I'm here now. I'm really looking forward to talking with you today about something that's very dear to my heart, which is Trans Day of Remembrance. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now for a little like PowerPoint presentation that I have put together for y'all. Okay, I'm hoping that that worked.
Yep, looks like it will. Oh, there we go. Very nice.
Thank you. Please go like that. So today we're going to be talking about Trans Day of Remembrance, an annual event that gives us a chance to honor and remember folks who have been lost to anti-transgender violence. I'm going to be breaking the session up into 3 parts. The first will be talking about LGBTQ and specifically gender identities. I'll then talk about Trans Day of Remembrance, what it is and where it came from. And then I'll move on to how Trans Day of Remembrance, or TDOR, can connect to Jewish practice. There's going to be time to ask questions after each section, so please hold your questions till then, or you can write them in the chat box and I'll answer them when I get to the question part. If I need to speak more loudly or if I need to speak slower, please somebody flag me and let me know and I will try to do that. I sometimes talk very quickly.
So I've already gotten a request for slower.
Okay, thank you. I will do my best. So I want to start by setting some intentions for us. We're going to be talking about some really sensitive issues today. Death, violence, and people's identities. That we please all try to be our best selves and please be as respectful as possible. You might have questions that come up about things that are confusing or totally different than how you normally think about things. Please do your best to ask your questions with care and respectful curiosity, and I will do my best to answer questions thoughtfully and with compassion as well. I'm sure you've heard about, I also want to say, please respect yourselves, and if you need to use the bathroom, go to the bathroom. If you need to get some water or tea or anything, please do that. I think that that's really important for like being in a thing, and being in a session is like making sure that you can be present in the ways that you need to be. I'm sure you've heard about LGBTQ identities before. Some of you may have LGBTQ individuals in your family or may identify as queer yourself. We all have different sets of knowledge, so some of what I share today may be old news to you, but I approach this first part as creating a shared language. I want to get us onto the same page as much as possible in order to have the conversations we need to have later on. So when we're talking about these identities, what we're talking about are people's sex assigned at birth, gender or gender identity, and orientation. 3 parts of a person that can impact who they love and how they move in the world. Gender or gender identity is a person's inner understanding of the gender or genders to which they belong or with which they identify. This is each person's unique knowing or feeling and is separate from a person's physical body or appearance, although there is often a relationship between those. Gender has more to do with culture and social norms, how we expect certain kinds of people to look and act. Sex, or sex assignment, is a person's assignment at birth based upon primary and secondary sex characteristics, genitalia, breasts, body hair, chromosomes, hormones, etc., as male, female, or intersex. Sex is more connected to biology and anatomy. Orientation is a pattern of emotional, romantic, and/or sexual attractions, a sense of one's personal and social identity based on attractions and the behaviors expressed them, oftentimes linked to the genders of the person one feels these attractions towards. You're probably most familiar with orientations like gay, lesbian, straight, and bisexual. And there's others as well, but those might be the most familiar. These 3 things are distinct from each other, but they also can impact each other. Sex often impacts gender, and orientation definitely relate to each other, and together, all 3 of these help to build a person's identity. For the purposes of this webinar, I'm going to be focusing less on orientation and much more on gender. So some terms that we can use to talk about gender. I'm going to rattle through some concepts and try to situate them so that there's a deeper understanding of this actually really complicated thing that we call gender. Gender identity, as I said before, is someone's personal sense of their gender. Gender expression has to do with physical appearance and the ways we present to the world. It's the physical manifestation of one's gender identity through clothing, hairstyle, voice, body, shape, etc., typically referred to as masculine or feminine. And then also, if you're looking at the image, for those of you who may be looking, there's a young child who, in a black and white photo, in a dress with long hair and a very pretty hat and Mary Janes and little socks. And what we'll often do in trainings is like ask people who they think that this is. And this young child is actually President Franklin Delano Roosevelt as a young person, which is just kind of to show how much our ideas of gender expression have changed over the years and how fluid that they can be in the ways that we understand them are always kind of shifting, even if we think they're very, very fixed. Gender attribution is a process by which a society assigns or ascribes a gender and/or sex onto a person with or without, usually without, knowing correctly what sex that person is or what gender they identify as. For instance, when someone is expecting a baby, and depending on whether it's a boy or a girl, all of the clothes and toys and decorations become one color or the other, blue or pink. So gender binary is the idea that there are only 2 genders, man and woman, with clearly recognized expressions and attributes, and that everyone falls into either side of that. Another way of defining it is a system of viewing gender as consisting solely of 2 opposite categories, termed male and female, in which no other possibilities for gender or anatomy are believed to exist. This system is oppressive to anyone who defies their sex assigned at birth, but particularly those who are gender variant or do not neatly fit into one of the 2 standard categories. An alternative model is the gender spectrum, which opens up the possibility of gender identities and expressions. There's a spectrum of possibility that can include man and woman, can include all the genders and their different permutations, allows for different combinations of masculinity and femininity and more. There can be movement and growth. It can be fluid, not fixed, and change over time. We're focusing a lot on these gender-based terms because so often sex and gender are conflated with each other when they're not actually the same thing. Sex is something that is assigned at birth, whereas gender is something people are socialized in. So I know that might have been a lot already, and we're kind of just maybe at the beginning of things, and we're about to do some more, so I want you to take a breath and give yourself a moment to absorb some of that. Okay, so now let's start tackling some of the identities that are going to be relevant in this conversation. I want to start by saying that, as I said before, sex and gender are often conflated, but are not actually the same thing. We'll often use man and male interchangeably, or woman and female, but we're actually talking about two different things. They influence each other, definitely, but are not one and the same. Male and female are what someone is assigned at birth, and then man and woman are the genders that people are expected to follow, respectively, from those assignments. We say assigned at birth because sex is often something that we don't get to decide for ourselves. Others, usually doctors, decide that for us. On the other hand, we can have more control over our gender. So you've probably heard the terms trans or transgender before. Transgender or trans are umbrella terms for anyone who knows themselves to be a gender that is different from the gender that they were assigned at birth and expected to be. Examples you might know of someone who was assigned male at birth but self-identifies as a woman, like Laverne Cox or Caitlyn Jenner, or someone assigned female at birth but self-identifies as a man, like Chaz Bono or Billy Tipton. Some transgender people modify their bodies through medical means, and some do not. Common terms that people use about themselves are trans men, trans women, and men or women of transgender experience. When we use those terms, we're talking about the gender they're living as now and how they identify. A trans woman or a woman of transgender experience is a woman, and the trans is just an adjective or a description. Just as there's transgender, there's also cisgender or cis, which for people who might not be able to see this, that's CIS gender, which means a person who is comfortable in the gender that they were assigned and understands herself to be a woman, as was assigned to her. Cisgender or cis is not pejorative. It's a way of describing another gender experience. It was developed to reframe the idea that there's a right and wrong way of having a gender, or a normal and an abnormal way of having a gender. It is used in contrast with transgender on the gender spectrum. Cisgender has its origin in the Latin-derived prefix cis, meaning on the same side, whereas trans means across. So we hear a lot about transitioning. Transitioning is a process where someone starts living their life as their gender identity. This can happen in a lot of different forms: social, cultural, legal, medical, telling people's friends, families, community. Some people choose to transition medically with hormone replacement therapy or gender-affirming surgeries, but not all trans people do. This can be because of access to information, access to wealth, access to community, the amount of support they have, their personal inclination, or even for safety reasons why they may or may not decide to transition in various ways. Transitioning, especially medical transitioning, is a private process, so it's inappropriate to ask about people's transitions just as we respect people's privacy on other personal matters. There's a term that you've probably heard that I've avoided until this point, and that's transsexual. Trans or transgender are the terms we use most now, and transsexual is often considered an outdated term or to refer to a particular subset of trans people. Transsexual tends to have more to do with medical transition, someone who's undergone surgery, for instance. It's usually considered kind of offensive unless someone has identified themselves as transsexual. Some other terms that we've outgrown as our understanding of gender has deepened are transvestite, male to female, MTF, and female to male, FTM. There are people who still use these terms for themselves, and if somebody uses them for themselves, that's okay, because that's how they feel. But in general, these are not things that we really call people anymore because of, as I said, a sort of updated understanding of gender. So now we're going to shake things up a little bit more in just a moment. And so if you're feeling some resistance to this, I just want to challenge you to challenge yourself to receive this and try to understand that even though we're talking about these as terms and that they may be new to you, we're actually talking about people who are living their lives and have gone through a lot of difficult thought and processing to reach these places.
Jacob, if I may interrupt you 1 second, two things. The first one is you're throwing a lot of information at people, and I've gotten a couple of requests that we slow down a little bit so they can sort of follow you. And the second question that came up was, is there any aspect where halakha plays a role in aspects of Keshet's policies or approaches?
I'm going to save the second one for later. Thank you. I will, again, try to slow down. I'm trying to speak very more slowly than I normally do, and I will continue to do so. Yes, I understand that this is a lot of information, and it's, yes. So a lot of the trans identities that I was just talking about cling to this idea of the man-woman binary, a gender binary that I had brought up before. Somebody moving from one side to the other. We think about trans people in the sense of transitioning neatly from being one to the other, from being a man to a woman or woman to a man. But there are many trans people who may have an alternate gender identity that is neither man nor woman. And for some people, their gender identity may vary at different points in their lives. Some of these identities, just to name them, don't worry about holding all of them, are genderqueer, agender, non-binary, bigender, and more. People have developed a lot of different ways to identify themselves, is sort of the idea. I'll talk about one of them in particular in a moment, just to sort of help situate it a little bit more, but just I'm going to leave that there for a moment. For many of these people, the normative standards of gender expression experience feel limiting and untrue to who they are, so they realize that they occupy a different gender space from being a man or from being a woman. Many of these people are gender non-conforming, meaning their gender expression, this might be the clothes that they wear, the makeup that they do or don't use, their gender expressions don't align with societal expectations based on their perceived gender, what people expect or see their gender to be. But just because someone is gender non-conforming does not mean that they are trans. There are times that people will be, in their presentation, will sort of bend or not conform to the expected ways that a certain gender is supposed to look, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are a transgender person or are transitioning. And so now to get you to something that you might have noticed at the beginning about me. So I identify as non-binary. I was assigned male at birth, and I was raised, socialized as a boy. So as a child, my parents raised me thinking I was a boy, and I was expected to do sort of like boy things, not always successfully. As I was getting older and becoming an adult, I realized that I didn't think that I was going to become a man. Masculinity and the things we associate with it didn't feel true to me as a person. However, neither did being a woman. So I realized that I didn't seem to be on a path to being a trans woman or transitioning from assigned male and potentially male to womanhood. There's many things associated with femininity that interest me or that seem to be my characteristics, but not exclusively. For me, being non-binary means that I feel outside of a binary or even spectrum of man and woman or masculine and feminine. I'm doing something that combines and rejects the history of those ideas as a way of creating a new reality where we can rethink what gender means and how that influences our world and each other. Now here's where things can get tough even for me, in that my gender expression doesn't always seem to line up with my identity. People tend to read me or think that I'm a man because I wear mostly clothes that are made for, quote, men, button-ups, men's pants, etc. My name is the name that I use is one that is associated with men. I have a certain voice that even if it is a little bit high-pitched, maybe it still tends to be read as being a man's voice. Some of all of this is because when it comes to like my style and like the clothes that I wear and things like that, some of that is because I actually understand my expression differently, and the way that I dressed is based off of an aesthetic that was created by queer people. And some of it really is that it's a struggle for me to figure out how I want to look in this world when we have very like rigid ways of looking and very understood and like segregated gendered clothing. I have to deal with the reality that my body is one typical of being assigned male at birth. I have wide shoulders, I have narrow hips, and some of the other things that I said before. Because of this, many clothes made for women don't fit on me, on my body, the way that I'd like them to, and that actually makes me feel really uncomfortable in my body. It sort of like points attention to things that I don't really know how to reconcile with sometimes, because it's really hard to change one's body. And I guess to go a little bit deeper, I'm not sure if I'm somebody, as of yet, I'm not on any sort of hormone replacement therapy, and I'm not sure that that's something that I'm even interested in, even though that is a thing that other non-binary people might do. There's also, so one of the other reasons that I tend not to wear clothes that are associated with womanhood is that there's the fact that moving in the world in feminine presentation, in women's clothing and traditionally feminine looks, often makes someone much more vulnerable to violence, especially when someone is not conforming with the gender expression expected of them. Oh, didn't know that I did a little thing. A couple of things that come into play for trans people are names and pronouns. Often when someone transitions, they claim a new name or go through a few names to find the one that feels true to who they are and the gender that they're now living as, or the gender that they've always known themselves to be, but are now really getting to be. We always use people's chosen name. Often the name that they left behind, what's called a dead name, brings up a lot of pain and memories of hardship for people. It's a symbol of something that they're trying to leave behind. It is especially true for people who have passed away to continue to respect them with their correct name after death. By correct name, I mean their chosen name, not their dead name or their given name. As for pronouns, this can be really hard for people. We use pronouns constantly and often without a thought, but in English, pronouns are a way that we can very quickly guess someone's gender. We use she, her, hers for women most often, and he, him, his for men most often. When someone transitions, we use the pronouns that they're now using. A trans woman, someone assigned male at birth, whose gender is a woman, we use she, her, hers when we talk about her. What might surprise you is that she, her, hers, and he, him, his aren't the only pronouns we use for individuals. My pronouns are they, them, their, as you might have heard in the bio and as I stated at the beginning. Since I'm non-binary, neither he, him, his, nor she, her, hers are an accurate way of referring to me. They, them, their is a gender-neutral way to talk about me without incorrectly gendering or misgendering me. There's a lot of resistance to they, them, their from people who haven't heard them used like this before. Oftentimes, people will say that it's grammatically incorrect because it's a plural pronoun for an individual person. The thing is that there's centuries of precedent in the English language for using they, them, their for individuals. It was also recognized by the Merriam-Webster Dictionary 3 years ago as the word of the year for its individual usage. And another thing is that we actually use it this way much more often than we think. If you don't know someone's gender, they, them, their is a really common default. For instance, you might say, someone left their jacket, because you don't know who it belonged to. People have developed gender-neutral alternatives, other gender-neutral alternatives as well, like Z, here, here's, and Z, zers, zers, and others, but they, them, their tends to be the most popular because they're the ones we already know. We already use them. They're familiar to us. If you're looking at the screen, there's a little chart of pronouns and different options where when you would use them and examples for using them. My stance on pronouns is also this. If it means enough to somebody that they've asked you to use these pronouns, then it's also worth trying your best to respect that person and be kind to them. They're not doing it to be malicious to you. They're trying to live authentically. To me, it's worth accepting the challenge and pushing past what we're used to doing in the name of respecting and caring for people. But this is also to say, guess what? You're gonna make mistakes. I make mistakes all the time, and I will use the wrong pronoun, and I use these pronouns, or I use alternative pronoun. It's okay. A quick apology and a self-correction is perfect. No need to over-apologize or talk about how hard it is. It's definitely a challenge. Just keep practicing. People usually won't get too mad, although there might be a little bit of hurt. But I think most people, and speaking for myself, I definitely know when somebody is trying, when they're making an effort rather than when they don't try at all, which hurts and offends all the more. So I know that was a lot. I really appreciate your patience. I'm sorry if I went too quickly. Let's take a breath and then I will answer your questions. So if you have them in the chat box, I can answer them from there. If I can pull it up. There we go. Okay. I see it. Thank you, though. So the first one is, the Halakha or Jewish law tradition play any role in aspects of Keshet policies? Isaac, would you mind explaining what you mean by this a little bit more?
Well, there are certain traditions, and by the way, even 1,000 years ago, there was, I'm using the term transgender questions about male and female, so it's nothing new. And it's brought down in some of the commentaries the rabbis in Provence, France, and in Bologna, Italy, and so forth. But there are certain halachic guidelines. For example, you cannot change your sex willingly. You're not allowed to. You cannot hurt yourself willingly. This is a couple of questions. You have to be, to some degree, satisfied with what nature gave you and God gave you. So when policies are decided, and I'm not sure the role you play, I think you mentioned it earlier, but I don't see your title there. Specifically, does somebody say, okay, let's see what our 2,000-year-old tradition has to say about this? Does that come up at all in any meetings or anything?
Yeah, so that is a little bit less of what Keshet does, where we don't do so much of talking about halakha and Jewish law, although we will when we need to. But there are a lot of queer religious leaders, spiritual leaders, rabbis, professors who have thought a lot about this. And they have found, I'm not an expert on this, so I can't speak very deeply, but I've been in conversations before where there are examples that support queer and trans identities, that do support transitioning even, and that includes surgery. So I can only partially answer your question, unfortunately. It is out there, these answers, and there's people who are thinking about that, but that's not the focus of my work, and it's things that I've picked up in spaces I've been, but I don't know as deeply as the people who study this for years and years, I would say.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
If I may throw in one thought, there was a point at one time when someone was talking about the fact that there had been, in one Talmudic discussion, a sort of range of genders that was discussed, and I think there were
I'm going to talk about that in just a second, actually.
You're on. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. Because Edna brought something up that I think that leads me to that is really helpful. She said, what I learned is that homosexuality has only one Talmudic reference. The issue is whether or not two yeshiva boys could share a bed and blanket, and the answer was yes. So the Talmud actually talks a lot about gender, and there are 6 genders in the Talmud. There is man and woman. There is tumtum and androgynous, which are two kind of non-binary and genderqueer type identities of not being either a man or a woman. They tend to relate more to sexual characteristics, either having vagina and a penis, or having neither, which can also get into intersex, which is something I haven't really touched on. Intersex being people whose sex doesn't seem to fall cleanly into male or female, and a host of different syndromes. So there's those two, and then there are 2 other genders which seem to connect to our ideas of a trans woman and a trans man, in that somebody who we thought was a boy or thought was a man is actually a woman, and somebody who we thought was a woman is actually a man. And there's actually some support. There's support for that, and the idea being that if that's how people understand themselves to be, then they have to be their authentic self. It's a little more complicated than that. This is kind of a gloss, but there's hundreds of references to each of them. There's an activity that we sometimes do that that we talk about those and really go deeply. And I also want to name that normally when I'm talking about these things, I'm not just like offering it all and like doing it more in a lecture style. I usually am doing it in activities to really sort of engage and get people thinking. And I just wasn't sure how to make that happen on a webinar. So thank you for your patience. And then, does being non-binary make me feel more fulfilled, happier, and more contented, I'm assuming? It doesn't make my life easier. And it doesn't make a lot of things easier. And I definitely come up against a lot of hard stuff because of it. But also, it feels like I'm more in line with who I am. Like I'm not having to pretend, I'm not having to lie to myself, I'm not experiencing something like what's called like dysphoria, which is like a real sense of disassociation between like body and mind, and all that. And so in that, yes, definitely. It's who I am, and I'm happy that I was able to come to the realization sooner than later, although it's also still a thing that I'm figuring out, because there's not really a guide to it. There's plenty of other people who identify this way, but we all relate to it in different ways. Thank you, Zoe. If we have, from LR Altman, if we have a male and female CK, Hever Kadisha, I'm assuming, how do we know what gender Hever Kadisha deceased would prefer? Ask them, their family. This is a really, really good question, and a thing that some people are talking a lot about. The person that is doing some of the most thought about this is a trans person named Noach Zizmira, who he's really thinking about how to rethink Hever Kadisha practices. The idea is that we honor the gender identity that the person, the deceased, understood themselves to be. However, from the conversations I had with him a while ago, what he also said was that the Hever Kadisha group that would be with that body doesn't necessarily need to be the gender that, if it's a trans man with men, that's not necessarily always the best either, because the most important thing is that the body needs to be respected. And so I think the idea is that in order to provide Hever Kadisha for trans folks, to have a group that would be respectful of all bodies, I think there would be some more, there's still more to be figured out. And again, and Hever Kadisha is something that I've still like very lightly touched. It's something I'm actually like kind of definitely interested in, but haven't had a chance to explore much. But these are things that are still being figured out, and we're kind of just now getting to the point where trans people are starting to pass away while they're in communities. That wasn't a reality for a really long time because trans people weren't welcome in communities until recently. From Eliza, would you remind us what personally I would suggest the term authentic. Thank you, authentic is good. Would you remind us what the Talmudic terms are that seem to align with trans man and trans woman? I don't remember right now, and I don't have them in front of me. I can pull them up later and send them out. I think one of them is something like Sarai, S-A-R-A-I in transliteration. Tumtum is one of the sort of more non-binary ones. Let's see. I wish our society could be more flexible, the terms and concepts of masculine and feminine, rather than people having to change themselves. I think there's room for both. I think we need to do a lot of deconstruction around gender and thinking about how we can be, and we need to rethink about how they're in relationship to each other and how their relationship to the world, and how they're these classes of like working or being in the world, because they still have like such impact, even though there's been such a wave of feminism and like many, many years of putting that work in, and a lot of like queer rights activism, there's still a lot of work to do to really think about how we do that. Isaac, has your family accepted your status? I appreciate the question, but I'm actually going to sidestep talking about my personal life much more. And I appreciate you. I hope that you will accept that. If you want to have a conversation more one-on-one with me, I would welcome that, but I don't need to like go into everything about my family, which is not to say my family hasn't like rejected me or anything like that. Yes, Zakhar. Yes, cool. Elinot and Cerise, those are the two that are connected to trans women and trans men, but I don't remember which is which. Thank you, Zoe. Were there any other questions? Feel free to type them into the chat box, or if you just want to say them out loud, by all means, please do so.
This is Isaac speaking. Our Chevra Kadisha policy, I run the Chevra Kadisha here in the Upper East Side of Manhattan. Sorry. And the sect that the person wanted to be is the group that does the Tahara, unless there are prurient issues involved, like a man being turned on by a woman's breasts, etc. So that's been our general policy. We've had a handful, but it seems to be increasing. Well, New York City is a little bit of everything, so I guess we'll be exposed to everything sooner or later.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of movement, and I think a lot of like trying out new things in different communities, and I think it's starting to like gain a lot of momentum. Was there any other questions before we move into the next part?
I don't see any.
Okay. Great, thank you. If you have a question about something, if something comes to your mind later, then we can talk about it in the next question portion.
Just an interesting point to give you a break, Jacob. There are more, Rab Moshe Isserlis, who wrote the Shulchan Aruch that we basically follow, was written around 1520 or so. I believe he remarried, and his wife he couldn't have any children. And he claimed that through Ruach HaKodesh, through Nevi'ot, God came to him and told him that his wife is really a man in a woman's body, and that's why she couldn't have any children. So that's just, I don't understand it, but whatever it is, just an interesting point to give you a break.
I don't know if I've heard that story before, but they're specifically about like the sort of child having, but there are stories like throughout like Jewish history of these kinds of things. So it's really not new. And like these are questions that have been coming up for ages, forever even, and are either always butting up against the understood ideas of gender, but are always happening regardless, which I really think also goes to show that like it's not unnatural. It's a part of society, a part of being alive, and everything like that.
Just one more fun story. My youngest, my daughter, had a little girl a couple of years ago. So on the birth certificate, this is New York City, she lives in the city, they asked her, the mother, how does she want to be identified, as a male or a female? So I found that a little striking because my daughter having the baby just like is a female. But New York City is getting with the program, I guess.
Yeah. Okay, so I have a whole Q&A slide. So I wanted to go through all of those identities and like break that down because I think it's really helpful to have a clearer sense of trans and queer identities before we talk about Trans Day of Remembrance, which deals with some of the harsher realities of being trans or being gender nonconforming. Trans Day of Remembrance is a national and international occasion to memorialize transgender and gender nonconforming people who have been killed as a result of transphobia or anti-trans violence. It is on November 20th every year, and many communities across the country and world observe it. TDOR, Trans Day of Remembrance, or TDOR, was founded in 1999 by a trans woman named Gwendolyn Ann Smith to memorialize the murder of another trans woman, Rita Hester, in Allston, Massachusetts. Hester was stabbed 20 times in her apartment in what the community believes to be a hate crime, especially since nothing from her apartment was stolen. Since then, it's grown through online and communal sharing in a holiday recognized by many communities and even the government of Ontario, I found out. The reason why it's caught hold, I think, is because trans folks are at extreme risk of violence. Transphobia is the irrational fear. Is this Transphobia is the irrational fear or hatred of people who break or blur gender roles and sex characteristics, which exists in both the heterosexual and gay communities. This is to say that transphobia exists both in straight cultures and in gay cultures, which you think that we would all be allies, but we're not always, and there are things that come up, and one of those things could be transphobia. Expressed as negative feelings, erasure, attitudes, actions, and institutional discrimination against those perceived as transgender or gender nonconforming, or the fear of being perceived as transgender or gender nonconforming. And all too often, transphobia can become violent attacks, which is why I and people in my community will often say anti-trans violence instead of just transphobia in order to highlight the violent and deadly backlash against people who are perceived to not be conforming to gender norms. Before I continue, I want to name that I'm going to be talking about some tough realities around violence and mortality, because I want to paint a really clear picture of what the reality of being trans is before I talk about why TDOR and Remembrance are so important. Over the past few years, there's really been a greater understanding and awareness of trans people. There's been a proliferation of trans identities, and more people are able to live their full lives as the gender they know themselves to be. There's been advancements in trans rights. There's trans representation in public figures, if you know where to look. There's lots of trans organizations and nonprofits that work on trans issues. There's greater visibility, which is really heartening in so many ways. And also, as far as we can tell, violence is on the rise. Every year seems to be more and more violent to trans folks, and the list of trans people who have been killed grows each year. Trans folks are at a disproportionate risk for violence, particularly trans women, and especially trans women of color, due to the intersections of identity. The average life expectancy for a trans person is 30 to 32 years old, from a report a couple of years ago. This is between medical complications, violence, and high rates of suicide. This is in nations like America, Canada, and Britain, which we think of as being more developed or more tolerant as compared to many other places in the world. There was a survey put out in 2015, the first of its kind, the US Transgender Survey, examining the experiences of transgender people all over the country. It examined aspects of life such as education, housing, employment, violence, family life, income, faith, and more of trans people of all kinds of identities. One of the major findings was alarmingly pervasive harassment and violence. From the survey, nearly half of respondents were verbally harassed in the past year because of being transgender. Nearly 1 in 10 were physically attacked. Nearly half were sexually assaulted at some point in their lifetime, and 1 in 10 were sexually assaulted in the past year. More than half experienced some form of intimate partner violence, including acts involving coercive control and physical harm. Nearly a quarter have experienced physical violence by an intimate partner, severe physical violence by an intimate partner, compared to 18% in the greater US population. I know this is really hard to hear. It's sad, it's scary, and it's disheartening. And this is really just the light touch. I encourage you to look at the executive summary and full report of the survey to get a clearer picture. The trans and queer community live with a lot of fear and a lot of grief. Not only are we at risk of violence out in the world and in our own homes, we're also losing people constantly. There was a trans person who I didn't know personally, but I was in community with, and a lot of people who I'm very close with, who died by taking their own life a couple of weeks ago. So I'm not just like saying this is like really real and fresh. And so far this year, there have been 8 trans people murdered, and those are just the ones we know about. The people who are listed here, put up on the screen, are the 8 people who have died this year. As far as I could tell, they were all trans women, and many of them are trans women of color, which falls pretty much in line with what I had been saying before. So how does a community respond to this loss? Observance. Setting aside a time to remember and name the people who died and mourn them. TDOR events will often include vigils, have speakers to share their experiences, or share stories about the people who were lost, if the speakers knew them. People come together in community to lean on each other and be in a space where people can be their full selves and grieve. I think this will resonate with us all, the importance to remember, to mourn, and to grieve when we lose people we know or people who are connected to us even distantly. I've only been to the TDOR events in the Bay Area, but from what I've seen around, it seems that the most common practice is to say the names of each person who died that year that we know of. Saying their names is so important so that they're not just numbers or statistics. They're not faceless figures lost to oblivion. They were people with identities, with personalities, with friends and family and community. They matter especially because they died too soon. This way we can honor them. We remember who we're there for. But it's not just about remembering and honoring. More and more, there's a shift in the consciousness of TDOR, so that's also becoming a Trans Day of Resilience. As it says on the Trans Day of Resilience, tdor.co website, it's a time to honor the resilience and power of our living trans family. A time to imagine thriving trans futures by celebrating a different kind of TDOR, Trans Day of Resilience. That idea, current name, and spirit emerged from a 2015 call from New Orleans trans justice organization Breakout to celebrate the power of our living trans family. By coming together, we strengthen our connections to each other and our commitment to this work. Through this remembrance and resilience, we begin to resist a transphobic world and take that heart with us into our everyday. Okay, so I'm going to pause here for a second for some more questions and responses. I just want to name that the artist who made this poster that I have up on the screen that says "Remember Trans Lives, Fight for Trans Lives," the artist is Micah Bazant, who is a Jewish trans artist, person, and organizer, who has been really one of the foremost leaders in trans Jewish culture, and is like a really, really special person. So like I said, I'm going to pause here for just in case you have any questions or any things that you want to talk through, but then I'm going to move into Jewish observances, TDOR Shabbat, and just generally putting together a TDOR event. So the Jewish stuff is all, we're about to get back to that in a few minutes. Questions?
Okay, if you have a question, you can either type it or you can unmute yourself and ask.
Okay, seems like there's not any questions. Great. I just wanted to make sure we had the space for that. How am I doing? Am I speaking at a helpful pace? Is it feeling more accessible?
My sense is yes. I'm not getting any comments from anyone, so
okay.
I think you're doing fine.
Thank you. Okay. So for those of us who are Jewish and trans, or Jewish and in community with trans people, it can feel important to remember through Jewish ritual. And of course, there are trans people who are Jewish, who are at risk as well. But it's not just that. For me, as a Jew, it's a part of my practice to support marginalized communities as an act of solidarity in line with the Jewish value of Al tifrosh min hatzibur. Do not separate yourself from others or from the community, as taken from Pirkei Avot. The loss that TDOR commemorates is a communal one, a societal one. It speaks to the long moral arc we're still bending. Observing TDOR through a Jewish practice is a way for me and others to solemnize that time through deeply held traditions, to make it significant in a way that's deeply personal and culturally and spiritually potent. When TDOR comes around, there are many ways for a Jewish community to mark it. There can be programs throughout November that offer education to the community on trans experiences, programs that create space for trans folks to gather, or organizing a group of your community members to attend a TDOR event in your area in solidarity. These are all great ways to infuse into your community a stance of trans inclusion and T-door support. However, I want to talk about a practice that's particularly important to me and a powerful way of manifesting remembrance. Shabbat is a time when Jewish communities come together to pray, reflect, and create community, and to mourn. In every service, there's always a time for reflection, for healing, and for mourning, and it's far from uncommon to bring themes into our Shabbat practices. I also want to name, because I realized I didn't jot this down in my notes, when I'm talking about Shabbat, I'm usually talking about a Friday night service that involves a Kabbalat Shabbat and a Ma'ariv, and sometimes, in the ways that I've done it, some other, like another portion. I assume there are people who might have done some kind of Saturday service thing, but for most of what I see, it's Friday night services. So I've been involved and led 3 Trans Day of Remembrance Shabbats through Keshet and Glitter Tequila. Each year, I feel the intense emotion that comes with loss and the understanding of how much violence and hatred there is in the world. And each year, I also feel the peace that comes from being with my community and from using our blessings and prayers to refortify myself and ourselves. I want to offer to you some ways of bringing T-door into Shabbat. Keshet put out a guide a few years ago that I'm going to start with. It's a little bit old, but it still offers some really good and varied resources for infusing a Shabbat between prayers, stories, sermons, or activities. I'm going to talk about a couple prayers and leave the rest of that guide for you to discover on your own. It's on our website. There's a link to the website at the end as well. And I'll find that if there's other resources that people want, other things that I've named that people would like access to, please let me know and I can put together an email with things. So the first prayer is one called Twilight People, written by Rabbi Reuben Zellman, one of the first ordained trans rabbis. He and another trans rabbi, Elliot Kukla, worked on a project called Trans Torah that approached Jewish liturgy and traditions from a trans perspective to make them feel relevant and accessible. Twilight People is as follows. As the sun sinks and the colors of the day turn, we offer a blessing for the twilight. Twilight is neither day nor night, but in between. We are all twilight. There are many identities and loves, many genders and none. We are in between days or between place and place. We are crisscrossed pattern. We are neither day, nor we are both, neither, and all. May the sacred in-between of this evening suspend our certainties, soften our judgments, and widen our vision. May this in-between light illuminate our way to the God who transcends all categories and definitions. May the in-between people who have come to pray be lifted up into this twilight. We cannot always define, we can always say a blessing. Blessed are you, God of all, who brings on the twilight. This is one of my favorite blessings. Without fail, it moves me deeply and seems to do so for many of the folks that it's shared with. It can be used as an alternative to the Ma'ariv Aravim or as a supplemental reading before or after the Ma'ariv Aravim. But also, you can figure out how it best fits into your own service. Another prayer is one that is specifically for Trans Day of Remembrance, again written by Rabbi Reuben Zellman. Rather than just speaking to the experience of being trans or queer, this prayer really highlights the significance of T-door and gathering for it, what's been lost and how it connects to us. God, full of mercy, bless the souls of all who are in our hearts on this Transgender Day of Remembrance. We call to mind today, young and old, of every faith, race, and gender experience who have died by violence. We remember those who have died because they would not hide or did not pass, or did pass, or stood too proud. Today we name them, the reluctant activist, the fiery hurler of heels, the warrior for quiet truth, the one whom no one really knew. As many as we can name, there are thousands more whom we cannot, and for whom no Kaddish has ever been said. We mourn their senseless deaths and give thanks for their lives, for their teachings, and for the brief glow of each holy flame. We pray for the strength to carry on their legacy of vision, bravery, and love. And as we remember them, we remember with them the thousands more who have taken their own lives. We pray for resolve to root out the injustice, ignorance, and cruelty that grow despair. We pray, God, that those who perpetuate hate and violence will speedily come to understand that your creation has many faces, many genders, and many holy expressions. Blessed are they who have allowed their divine image to shine in the world. Blessed are you, God, in whom no light is extinguished. As it mentions the Kaddish, this could be read before the mourner's Kaddish as something to hold in mind during the reading, or afterwards to expand upon that blessed space. There are many more ways than just these two to incorporate and dedicate a Shabbat to Tidor in this guide. If you're willing to bend tradition a bit and supplement more, there's many readings and practices that can take on the power and function of the prayers we normally say. Consider bringing in a yahrzeit candle and lighting it before the Shabbat candles as a way of sanctifying the space as one for remembrance. Use the Kabbalah Arabim to greet the mourners in the room and to name that in this service, we are all mourners who are collectively mourning the victims of transphobia this year. For blessings for creation, for love, for redemption, consider bringing in readings that trans people have created over the years that speak to their experiences and raise the often silenced voices of trans folks. A sort of centerpiece of a Mariv service, the Amidah could become a time for intense reflection on trans lives and queerness. There is a queer Amidah that could be offered as an option, along with the traditional Amidah. Another way to approach the Amidah is how to frame it for people to hold in their minds as they meditate or pray. As a doula, a prayer for redemption, consider bringing in a call to perseverance. For example, I've used Audre Lorde's Litany for Survival, a call to tenacity in the face of oppression. The final words of that are, so it is better to speak, remembering we were never meant to survive. You could bring in the Hashkivenu, a prayer for protection, to go to sleep in the night and wake up the next day to be wrapped once more in a shelter of peace, a shelter from the violent transphobic world, from the many hardships we all face. There's a great piece that Black trans woman Laverne Cox, who you may recognize from Orange is the New Black, wrote about being Black, about passing and not passing, and about police brutality. And then there's the Miko Mocha, a song that doesn't even need to be replaced because it so perfectly touches on a dream we all share: liberation. Liberation from defined gender roles, liberation from violence toward those who don't conform, liberation from hatred and fear of that which isn't the norm, liberation for us all to be exactly who we know ourselves to be. And of course, what kind of service would it be without a Mishaverach? Reflecting and asking for protection are so important, but we also need to care for the tenderness that we're feeling. The Mishaverach allows us to bring in healing so that we can bring that peace into the rest of the world. I want to share a queer Mishaverach written by McGeed Andrew Raymer, who's not trans, but is a queer visionary. In community with our queer ancestors, most of whose names are lost to us, forgotten, or even deliberately obliterated, may we be blessed and healed in free and open ways, not always granted to those who went before us. May we come to know a time of complete healing, and may we share this healing with all the world in the name of all who have been forgotten, as a blessing for all queer folk who are here and for all of those who are yet to come. Now let us say Amen. The final prayer that I want to talk about is the Mourner's Kaddish. It's one of our oldest and holiest prayers, and in many ways one of our most beautiful. I think it says something that a prayer like that is the one we use to remember those we've lost. And I think that's also why it can be such an important part of the Tidor Shabbat service. In the tradition of sharing names, what I've done with my co-leaders at Tidor Shabbats is read out the names of each person who has passed that year as available on the website tidor.info. I'll put the name of a person on the index cards and pass out to the attendees so that each of them can share a name for us all to hear. We ask that everyone rise for the Mourner's Kaddish because this is a loss we're all observing. We're all in the mourning period. We're all connected. Once we finish, and as ever, we ask that their memories be for a blessing. I hope I've shown how much Jewish tradition is one that is rife for healing and fortification, which you may already be very familiar with. We have these tools at our disposal developed over the millennia to work within ourselves and to work with our community's ways of strengthening. If you decide to sit down and put something together like this, but are feeling overwhelmed or uncertain about how to go about it, don't fear. Pretty much any prayer out there has a trans or queer version of it. Some really great resources on finding those are Keshet's website, Trans Torah, Ritual Well, which has a subsection dedicated to LGBTQ prayers, and the Siddur Shar Zahav. to take a moment from this about this Siddur Shar Zahav, because that's where I've pulled many of these prayers from, these reworkings from. The Siddur Shar Zahav was developed by Congregation Shar Zahav, the first LGBT synagogue in the country, and is a really beautiful act of loving labor with Jewish tradition. I highly recommend it. There's also so many trans poems and writings that can be used as well, with appropriate credit given. But if you're still feeling unsure, then support trans and queer people into stepping into leadership positions and developing a Tidor Shabbat, a ritual that feels meaningful to them. I think it's also the most appropriate and just choice to try to center queer and trans leadership as much as possible when doing work like this. Solidarity and support isn't just going gung-ho forward, it's also making space for others to come forward. Create space in the center for those who have been on the margins. Hopefully the margins won't be so marginalized one day, and the separation between the two won't be so harsh. So I want to conclude with another Jewish value. That's Olam Elohim, the idea that we are all made in the image of God, of our bodies, each of our bodies and each of ourselves is a sacred form and idea. We each deserve to be honored as a spark of humanity that's alive. Thank you. Okay, so I saw some things popping up. Let me see where we were. All right.
Question, certain day of the Hebrew or secular calendar.
Thank you, Zoe, for your thanks. I'm really happy to hear about your daughter. Thank you, Isaac and Eliza and Holly Blue. Yes, Eliza, amen to Twilight Blessing. And same to you, Mira. Zoe, is there a certain day of the Hebrew or secular calendar that is set aside for this Trans Day of Remembrance? Yes, November 20th of the secular calendar is when it happens. So one of the things that I didn't talk about, how interesting, Joe, in 2018, that is 12, he said. One of the things that I didn't talk about is that November 20th obviously doesn't always fall on a Friday. So what the people that I work with in my community, what we'll often do is we'll do it the Friday before or the Friday after, so that it's still timely and it feels relevant. What we often do, though, if November 20th does fall on a Friday, because I'm in the Bay Area and there's a lot of queer and trans folks who are very involved, we tend not to do a Tidor Shabbat on a Friday that's November the 20th, so that people can go to like the big community events. And what we will sometimes do, we'll do a Shabbat maybe like the week before or the week before that, and we will ask that people pray with their feet and go to this event and support that event, because it's usually a very central communal event. So that's just one thing that I want to offer when we're talking about dates. I just want to remind people my pronouns are they, them, their. I'm really happy that this is like new information. Does Tidor include gay people? So Tidor centers trans experience. They're people gay people and queer people who will be involved at times in like helping to put that together, because they might be in community with trans folks and really want to like cement that. Oftentimes when we're doing a Tidor Shabbat, the prayers we're doing are not just for trans folks, but like the queer Meshaberach is for like the queer community broadly, or even the people, and even beyond that, the people that we're connected to, which eventually spills out to the whole world, if you want to look at it that way. But Trans Day of Remembrance is specifically around trans and transgender. There tends to be other times that are focused more on gay experiences, but also, to be frank, trans folks are more marginalized than gay people tend to be. There's been a certain amount of mainstreaming around sexuality and orientation. It's not ideal yet, I think. There's still a lot of holdout of discrimination and violence, for sure. But trans folks tend to be much more targeted at that risk. So that's why we separate out this particular time. And it also specifically, as I said at the beginning, came from the killing of a particular trans woman. Thank you, Jean. Do they publicize the community events? I've never seen anything. And who do you mean by they? I think you're still on mute.
And I've unmuted you. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you.
Okay. Well, any of the organizations, even Sheher Zahav, I've never seen flyers or anything. Now, maybe I'm missing it because I never looked for it before. But where are these community events? Are they are they all in San Francisco? Do we have some in Berkeley?
So for San Francisco, like the big community events tend to be are not necessarily Jewish, and they'll be like with the SF LGBT Center, TGIJP, Transgender, Gender Nonconforming, Intersex Justice Project, API Wellness. The Jewish ones, Shahrzad just started doing something this past year. I think they've done some like lower key things in the past, and maybe many, many years ago they did more. But from where I've seen it, the sort of like Tidor Shabbat of the Bay Area is the one that I'm involved in doing, and we put it out through Keshet and through Glitter Kehila, and we'll sometimes put it out through Kehila Community Synagogue as well.
Now, interestingly, I heard about it from my cousin Rachel Coburn, who's a rabbi in Elkins Park, Pennsylvania.
Yeah, so it's not just a San Francisco Bay Area thing. It does happen across the country. Boston usually has a few things going on, and I'm sure it's rippled out.
Jacob, is there more information on further slides? And if not, do you want to let the screen go so people
No.
can...
Oh, look at me.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hello.
There you are.
Thank you, Zoe, and thank you, Holly Blue. Really appreciate you being on here. And if you didn't see, my email address was on the screen that I just stopped sharing. You're all more than welcome to email me or call me if you have any like questions or conversations. But if there's anything that's coming up right now, I'm happy to talk about it.
Okay, any more questions, comments?
Yeah. Anybody, please feel free to unmute yourself or raise your hand and I'll...
Can you tell us more about your work with Noah?
Noah, I didn't really work with Noah so much as just sit down and have conversations with him. He and Hever Kadisha is something that has just more recently sort of like come to me as something that's interesting, although my conversations with Noah were, I want to say a couple of years ago now, wow. I don't know where his work stands now. He had to move across the country and was looking after his mother. But I think there have been some national calls and conversations about things. I think we might have talked about this. Wasn't there something that Kavod, I'm forgetting the name of the organization, did a couple years ago?
Yeah, we've done a number of things. Noah presented at one of our conferences, and then Lynn Greenhoff presented also at a conference. And also, as a result of one of our conferences, some folks started a discussion group called Trans Tahara.
Yes.
But I don't know that it's been very active. And there was also a person, I think, in the Berkeley area who was starting a Trans Tahara team, for lack of a better word. Not sure if that's an accurate description, but I don't remember his name.
Noah used to live in that area, so I wonder if it was him.
No, well, it wasn't Noah, but
Noah? Okay.
I don't know if other people remember, but
I recall.
I haven't heard about a Trans Tahara team being started, but I know we've had discussions in the Nativot Hever Kadisha, and what we are planning to do is, if we have somebody that's transgender, honor their preference, but maybe have a mixed team, men and women.
From my discussion with Noah, that seems to be what I'm hearing being sort of the path forward in a lot of ways.
Yeah, that's what we decided we would do. It hasn't happened yet, but when it does, that's what we'll do.
So I want to relate an experience. I got a call from a funeral director in Las Vegas who had a person die who was transitioning. I'm not sure in which way. And the Orthodox team that was doing the Tahara insisted on having a team of the person's birth gender rather than how they lived. And afterwards, so the funeral director was upset, and afterwards said to me, give me resources, show me, halacha content, show me something that I can educate myself on. I didn't have anything readily available. And that would be something that would be very useful for the Kavod Kadisha movement, to be able to have 10 resources and a discussion by some people, et cetera, et cetera.
If I can respond to that, I think you're right in that there's still a need, like a huge need for a lot more resources and a lot more work on this. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of people or places that are like dedicated to this yet. I think in many ways, they probably have a lot of overlap with you. So you know that, and you are potentially the leaders of that. Yeah, so speaking from like a perspective of somebody who works at Kesha and is involved with this group, Glitter Kahila, our focus does tend to be on like life practices. But unfortunately, or not even unfortunately, just realistically, everybody passes away. So and more there's going to be more trans people in Jewish community. That's a need that needs to be addressed. So hopefully this momentum just snowballs and things really come together. Mira, perhaps at Svara they could do some research of texts or talk with some rabbis at RNC. That's a really good idea. Svara is Queer Talmud Camp, which is led by Rabbi B'nai Lappi. It's a radically queer yeshiva, if anybody hasn't heard of it. And they do a very deep, intensive Talmud study in a very in a Beit Midrash and kind of a unique way that's sort of taking the American Jewish world by storm. And I think it's a really interesting idea if, as they continue to grow their capacity, if this is a thing that they could explore and talk about. I think that's a really cool idea. Does anybody have more thoughts or ideas? I also want to say that a lot of you are sending very, very appreciative and lovely messages, and I'm not replying to them all on the chat or saying them all, and I just want to really thank you for that and the warmth that you're all receiving me with. I had no idea really what I was going to walk into, despite Joe and Edna both being really lovely. So thank you for all of your receptivity to this conversation.
And you're always welcome to attend any of our conferences.
Thank you.
Next one coming up June 3rd, 4th, and 5th in Bethesda, Maryland.
All right. I'll be very busy with Pride, but thank you.
Shameless plug. Okay. Anything else? Anyone else?
Okay. Well, Jacob, thank you so much. This was really, really a good program. I think we all learned a lot. Thank you all for attending and your comments and questions. And we'll see you on, wait a minute, I have to look it up.
The 29th of April.
The 29th of April, and we will have Rabbi Yonatan Cohen, who will speak on disenfranchised grief. So we'll see you all then. And again, thank you, Jacob.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Good night.